Welcome back to my channel Learn with Virali. I'm Virali, your guide on this coding adventure. In this video of Project Management Kitchen series, we'll be learning about how to have an effective stakeholder management plan and make it successful for the projects that you are working on. So just like a perfectly layered dish requires right amount of ingredients, proper timing and a careful preparation, in the similar manner, managing stakeholders require us to understand what is their interest, what is their power, and an effective communication strategy. So let's get started. Alright, so let us gather the ingredients that we'd be needing in for cooking an effective stakeholder management plan. So first thing that we would need is the stakeholder identification, which will be considering it here as the assorted veggies that you can see over here. So just like each vegetable is important and unique, we need to understand that each of the stakeholder that we have into our project is going to be unique and have its own interest and power in working with the project. Next comes here is the seasoning chart, or we can consider this as a power or an interest grid. So here it explains that how we need to treat each of the stakeholder, like people here will be having high interest or high power or low interest or low power, so that we have to treat each of those ingredients or the stakeholders appropriately. Next we have is the communication method, or we can say this as what are the cooking methods that we are going to be using for cooking this effective stakeholder management plan, which is what we'll be considering, like we need to cook it on a high flame or a low flame. So each of this cooking method is gonna play its important role. So in order for, let's say, giving it up as a smoky flavor, we have to understand that we need to cook it in a different manner. So just like that, if the stakeholder is gonna be having a high interest or a high power, we have to update those stakeholders after each and every couple of days, or maybe as agreed by with the stakeholder as listed in the engagement plans. So we have to have effective communication methods while preparing an effective stakeholder management plan. Next we'll have is the sources or the engagement strategies that we'll be using in order to bring all the stakeholders together, just so that our cooking recipe is gonna be effectively tastier and more nice to smell. So in the first step, we'll be identifying the stakeholders. So remember, so just like selecting fresh ingredients for whichever dish you are trying to prepare, you need to identify what are the ingredients that you would need. So in a similar manner, if you are working on the project, you would need to understand that who will be your stakeholders. Now, many a times you have come across certain terms like internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, executive sponsors, team members. So it kind of creates confusion for you to understand who will be what in my project. So let us understand this one by one. So as our first base ingredient, we'll be talking about executive sponsors, or we can consider those as premium ingredients, or people who would be funding our project. So these will be executive sponsors. Next we have is the team member, which will be our core ingredient, because without the team members it's difficult to develop the entire product or the project. So those will be our core ingredients. Next will be having our end users, which will be identified as essential base ingredients, because these are the people who will be using your product at the end once it is developed. So we can consider them as end users or clients or customers who will be using these projects that we are building on. Next and the last thing that we have is the external stakeholders, or we can consider something like some sauces or some powders that will be sprinkling on the top or garnishing it with once the dish is ready. So that is going to give an extra flavor to our project or the recipe. So that's what we'll be considering it as an external stakeholders. In the second step, we would need to understand how to season the ingredients in a different manner. So here we'll be talking about the power or the interest grid, or power interest analysis is what we would call it as our second step in designing an effective stakeholder management plan. So the first thing that we have to understand is if the stakeholder is having a high power or a high interest, which is corresponding to a strong seasoning that we would need for the dish that we are going to be preparing on. So we need to understand that if it's going to be a high power or a high interest, we have to keep them closest. That means you need to regularly update these kind of stakeholders on what is going on with the projects. Let's say what are the problems that are coming on one by one, so that they'll be helping us to kind of solve those problems and help us to move on smoothly. Next we have is the high power but low interest. So that's where we'll be keeping the seasoning light as far as our cooking dish is concerned. So that's where we'll be understanding that we have to keep these kind of stakeholders satisfied by updating them regularly, let's say after a couple of days or as agreed on as per the engagement plan. So these will be considered as high power but having low interest in the project. Next we have is low power but high interest in the project. So that's where we'll be understanding that it is kind of a medium blend between their power and the interest in the project. So we need to keep these kind of stakeholders informed about what's going on, but not on the regular basis, but they have to be updated with whatever the project standing is after some couple of days as agreed on. The last one that we have is low power or low interest, which simply means that those are kind of basic seasonings that we'd be using in. So we can consider it over here as something called as monitor. So these kind of stakeholders needs to be monitored as they are anyway not highly interested or having any kind of a high power based on the project that we are working on. So in the step number 3, we'll be talking about how to have these stakeholders being engaged in our project. So let's say, for example, if you're cooking any recipe, you have to make sure that you understand whether it needs to be cooked on a high heat or whether it is needing slow cooking or cooked on simmer stuff, or it needs certain marination and so on. So, in a similar manner, while preparing an effective stakeholder management plan, it is necessary that we understand what is the engagement strategy that each of these stakeholders need. So, let's say, for example, if they are leading stakeholders, that means they are having a direct engagement with our project. So, we need to take them during our scrum and keep them informed about everything that's going on with the project. So it's kind of a similar thing that happens with a high heat when you try to cook your stuff, or let's say if you're cooking anything on the grill, it gets that direct heat that it needs. Next is to have a supporting stakeholder. So what that means is slow cooking that is required for certain dishes, wherein you have to understand that these kind of stakeholders who are supporting that they would be needing regular updates for them to give you an effective support that you need for your project. Third kind of a stakeholder is neutral. So just like we have to keep these kind of stakeholders informed about what's going on with the project, like how we do it with the simmer stuff cooking. The last kind of a stakeholder is resistant stakeholders, which is like they are resistant to certain changes that come in the project. So they are resistant towards the change management, which we can understand that we need to marinate certain stuff before we try to cook them. So if you are having a nice and set up barbecue, in that case you need to marinate certain ingredients that you would be using in for cooking it and then having it later on as the barbecued dish. So in a similar manner, you would be dealing with certain resistant stakeholders which are not ready to accept any kind of a change. So you need to marinate them with proper information so that they agree to those changes later on. So step number 4 is the effective communication plan, or the strategies that we need to use in terms of updating all the stakeholders that are engaged with our project. So just like plating, you would need to understand whether it's a fine dine presentation or it's a family style dinner, or it needs to be given in bite-sized portions, or if it's a buffet style kind of a lunch or a dinner, you would be presenting it in a different manner. So in a similar way, the communication strategies needs to be designed for us to understand how each of these stakeholders needs to be communicated. So if it's a kind of a fine dining presentation, we would be using certain kind of formal meetings for updating these kind of stakeholders. Or if it is going to be similar to a family style, we would be just having email updates, sending regular emails in regards to whatever is going on with the project, just so that they are informed about the things that are going on with the project, giving them email updates. Next is, if you are presenting it in the bite-sized portions, then you need to have those kind of quick chats which are short and sweet, yet giving all the required information for the project. And the last one is kind of a buffet style. So that's where you would be generating certain kind of reports which they would be using in for gathering certain insights and then effectively suggesting different things that needs to be improved as a kind of a feedback. So those will be our kind of a direct stakeholders. So with whom we'll be sharing certain reports after the end of, let's say, first quarter, or if we are preparing bi-weekly reports or monthly reports, those will be a different story. But these all will be listed in the engagement plans in terms of how we need to update these kind of stakeholders in terms of different kinds of communications that needs to be set up before starting the project. Okay, so now let us look at some common mistakes that could happen while preparing an effective stakeholder management plan or cooking any effective dish. So the first thing that we have to understand is we are not missing any ingredient. That's where we are not overlooking any stakeholders that are a part of our project. The second thing that we would be understanding over here is we will not overcook anything or any ingredient based on the recipe that we have. That means we are not providing any wrong engagement to the stakeholders that are a part of our project. The third thing that we'll be careful about would be to not have poor timing. That means not cooking or serving in too late or too often. So that's where you are not updating the stakeholders too late or too often based on the communication plan. The last thing that we would be being careful about is not having an uneven seasoning. That's where providing inconsistent communication towards the stakeholder based on the communication plan. Okay, so remember these four things to be careful about whenever preparing an effective stakeholder management plan. First is to identify the stakeholders early on. Second is to understand their interest and or their power. That means to understand their importance in the project. Third one is to use appropriate communications. That means deciding appropriate communication methods. And the last one is to monitor and adjust while preparing an effective stakeholder management plan. Alright, so now let's have a final look on how a sample stakeholder management plan looks like. As you can see on the screen, the stakeholder management plan contains the information about the identification metrics, the stakeholder assessments that have been done in regards to identifying their interests, their power, their roles, and many other details. Everything will be recorded in this particular document in a similar style in a way it has been mentioned over here. We also need to understand that we are effectively classifying them in terms of them being internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, or however they are affecting the project. They would be identified based on the roles that they have in the project. So if you have enjoyed watching this video, please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe, as it helps me to reach out more people just like you.